The Fulton County Courthouse buzzed with its usual Monday morning chaos as the July heat pressed against the tall windows like a heavy blanket. Judge Richard Whitmore's traffic court, Room 4B, was packed to capacity, with the wooden benches groaning under the weight of anxious defendants. The air conditioning struggled to combat both the Georgia summer and the nervous energy of those awaiting their fate. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Judge Whitmore swept into the courtroom, his black robe billowing slightly as he mounted the bench. His reputation preceded him. 20 years on the bench had earned him the nickname Quick Draw Whitmore for his rapid-fire judgments and zero-tolerance policy for excuses. The regulars, court officers, clerks, and local attorneys exchanged knowing glances as they prepared for another assembly line morning of justice. Among the sea of fidgeting defendants, Jasmine Washington stood out like a lighthouse in a storm. While others wore their Sunday best, pressed shirts, and modest dresses, she commanded attention in her theory charcoal suit and Christian Louboutin heels that probably cost more than most fines handed down in this courtroom. Her leather portfolio rested on her lap, a stark contrast to the crumpled citations clutched by those around her. "Is that Prada?" whispered an older woman sitting next to Jasmine, her own plastic purse clutched tightly against her floral dress. Jasmine offered a warm smile. "Actually, it's Bottega Veneta, a gift from my mother when I finished." She caught herself, choosing not to complete the sentence. Instead, she returned to reviewing her notes, occasionally glancing at her phone where messages from her office continued to pile up. One text from her assistant read, "SCOTUS clerk called again about the Tennessee case. Urgent." The proceedings began with Judge Whitmore's usual preamble, delivered in a tone that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "This is traffic court, people. We move quickly here. When your name is called, approach the podium. Speak only when spoken to. If you contest your citation, make it brief. If you're guilty, say so, and we'll all get home sooner." A young public defender in an ill-fitting suit shuffled his feet nearby, clutching a stack of files. He cast an appreciative glance at Jasmine before doing a double-take, squinting as if trying to place her face. She'd seen that look before, usually from lawyers who'd caught glimpses of her arguing cases in the federal courthouse downtown. The morning crawled forward like molasses. A parade of defendants approached the bench. A teenager with 3 parking tickets, an elderly man who ran a red light, a delivery driver with an expired registration. Judge Whitmore dispatched each case with mechanical efficiency, his gavel punctuating the air like a metronome. "Your Honor," a defendant pleaded, "I was rushing my daughter to the emergency room." "The posted speed limit applies to everyone, Mr. Rodriguez. $200. Next case." Jasmine observed each interaction intently, her manicured fingers making precise notes in her portfolio. She documented the judge's tone, his interruptions, his subtle shifts in demeanor based on each defendant's appearance. Old habits from her days investigating judicial misconduct died hard. When the clerk called case number 2021 TR 846, Washington, Jasmine, she gathered her belongings with deliberate grace. Several heads turned as she rose, her presence commanding attention without effort. Judge Whitmore barely glanced up from his papers, but the corner of his mouth twitched, perhaps at her attire, perhaps at her confidence, or perhaps at the melanin in her skin. As Jasmine approached the podium, she felt the weight of her federal prosecutor's badge in her jacket pocket. She debated whether to wear it to traffic court, eventually deciding against it. Sometimes, she learned, the most powerful card was the one you held until precisely the right moment. Little did Judge Richard Whitmore know, this wouldn't be just another routine traffic case, and his Monday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. "Ms. Washington," Judge Whitmore drawled, finally looking up from his papers. His eyes narrowed slightly as they met Jasmine's steady gaze. "Speeding violation on I-85. 78 and a 55. He peered at her over his reading glasses. "How do you plead?" The courtroom had settled into that peculiar silence that always preceded something interesting. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had ceased. Jasmine stood perfectly straight, her posture refined by years of arguing before federal judges who commanded far more respect than the man before her. Your Honor, before entering a plea, I'd like to address several procedural irregularities regarding this citation. Jasmine's voice carried clearly, each word precisely chosen. She opened her portfolio with practiced efficiency. First, the calibration records for the radar device used. Ms. Washington, Judge Whitmore interrupted, his voice sharp enough to make the young public defender flinch. This is traffic court, not the Justice Department. We don't need a dissertation on radar calibration. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the gallery. Jasmine didn't miss a beat. Your Honor, under Georgia Code Section 40-14-5, radar speed detection devices must be certified for accuracy every 6 months. The officer who issued this citation was using unit number RT-456, which according to public records. The judge's gavel cracked against the sound block. Enough. I'm well aware of the statute. What I'm not aware of is who gave you permission to turn my courtroom into a law school lecture hall. His face had reddened slightly, the first crack in his judicial veneer. The court clerk, a veteran of 15 years who had seen every type of defendant, straightened in her chair. Something was different about this one. The usual script was being rewritten before her eyes. Your Honor, Jasmine continued, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the judge's growing irritation. I'm merely exercising my right to present a complete defense. Additionally, the officer's sworn statement contains several inconsistencies that merit examination. If you'll allow me to. Ms. Washington. Judge Whitmore's voice boomed through the courtroom. Perhaps I haven't made myself clear. This is a simple traffic violation. You were caught speeding. Period. Your choices are equally simple. Guilty or not guilty. Jasmine closed her portfolio slowly, deliberately. In that case, Your Honor, I plead not guilty and request a formal hearing where I can present the evidence I've gathered, including dash cam footage that clearly shows. Request denied. The judge snapped. This court finds sufficient evidence to proceed immediately. He shuffled through the citation paperwork with obvious annoyance. Officer Johnson is one of our most reliable traffic enforcement officers. His word carries significant weight in this courtroom. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even regular court observers knew this was unusual. Traffic cases with contested evidence typically got kicked to a formal hearing. The young public defender had stopped pretending to review his files and was now openly watching the exchange. Your Honor, with all due respect, Jasmine's voice took on an edge that made several attorneys in the gallery exchange glances. Denying my right to present exculpatory evidence violates both state and federal due process requirements. I cite State v. Henderson, where the Georgia Supreme Court specifically held. The gavel slammed down again, harder this time. One more word about case law, Ms. Washington, and you'll be joining me for a contempt hearing. Judge Whitmore's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. Your fine is $750, plus court costs. Pay the clerk on your way out. Jasmine stood motionless for a moment, her expression unreadable. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, though none could have guessed just how extraordinary it was about to become. With deliberate movements, Jasmine reached into her jacket pocket. Actually, Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that made Judge Whitmore's head snap up. I think it's time we discussed my credentials. The badge of the United States Department of Justice caught the fluorescent lighting as she held it up, and for the first time that morning, Judge Richard Whitmore was completely speechless. The Department of Justice badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its golden eagle emblem commanding an immediate and profound silence in the courtroom. Judge Whitmore's face performed a remarkable transformation, from purple rage to ashen disbelief in the span of seconds. I am Assistant U.S. Attorney Jasmine Washington, she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the now dead quiet courtroom. Deputy Chief of the Civil Rights Division for the Northern District of Georgia. The words hung in the air like summer lightning. Judge Whitmore's hand tightened on his gavel, knuckles white against the wooden handle. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its previous thunder. "Ms. Counselor, why didn't you identify yourself at the beginning of these proceedings? Why should I have to?" Jasmine's question cut through the air like a blade. Would my profession change how justice is administered in this courtroom? She paused, letting the implication settle. Or perhaps more importantly, should it? The young public defender had pulled out his phone and was typing furiously. The court clerk had stopped pretending to work, her eyes darting between the judge and the federal prosecutor like she was watching a championship tennis match. "This is highly irregular," Judge Whitmore managed, shuffling papers on his bench with trembling hands. "I don't appreciate these theatrics in my courtroom, credentials notwithstanding." "Irregular?" Jasmine's eyebrow arched perfectly. "What I find irregular, Your Honor, is the pattern of procedural inconsistencies I've observed this morning." She reopened her portfolio, revealing pages of handwritten notes. "In the last 2 hours, I've documented 17 instances where white defendants were granted formal hearings for contested evidence. Yet in my case, that's enough." Judge Whitmore's gavel crashed down, but this time it sounded more desperate than authoritative. "This court will not be lectured on. Furthermore," Jasmine continued as if he hadn't spoken, her voice rising just enough to command attention without shouting, "I've noted a striking disparity in fine amounts. The average fine for white defendants today was $180. For defendants of color, it's been $425. And now you've attempted to charge me $750 for the same violation." The gallery erupted in whispers. Several people began reviewing their own citations, comparing notes with their neighbors. A local news reporter, who had been dozing in the back row waiting for a different case, was now frantically scribbling in his notepad. "These proceedings are now concluded," Judge Whitmore announced, reaching for his gavel once more. "No, Your Honor." Jasmine's voice cut through his attempt to end the session. "They're not. Because in addition to the fine, you threatened me with contempt for attempting to cite relevant case law, something you permitted from 3 white attorneys earlier this morning. I documented those instances as well." She withdrew a small digital recorder from her portfolio. "And thanks to Georgia's one-party consent law, I have audio of this entire proceeding." The color that had briefly returned to Judge Whitmore's face drained away again. In 20 years on the bench, he'd never faced anything like this. His courtroom had always been his kingdom, his word absolute. But now, in light of these developments, Jasmine continued, her tone shifting to one of professional courtesy, "I move that this case be dismissed. Additionally, I believe it would be appropriate for Your Honor to recuse yourself from any further proceedings today, pending a review of possible systemic bias in this court's handling of traffic violations." The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the courtroom watched Judge Whitmore, waiting to see how he would respond to this unprecedented challenge to his authority. His gavel hung suspended in his hand, like a conductor's baton frozen mid-stroke. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Case dismissed." Then, almost as an afterthought, "Court is adjourned for the day." But as Jasmine gathered her belongings, everyone in that courtroom knew this was far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning. The badge disappeared back into her jacket pocket, but its impact would resonate through the halls of justice for months to come. The revolution in Judge Whitmore's traffic court had begun with a simple speeding ticket and a not-so-simple defendant who refused to let injustice pass unchallenged. By 2 p.m., the morning's events in courtroom 4B had ignited a firestorm. Jasmine sat in her corner office at the federal courthouse, watching Atlanta's downtown shimmer in the afternoon heat while her phone buzzed incessantly. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution had already called 3 times. "Ma'am," her assistant Marcus poked his head in. "The chief judge of the district court is on line 1. And your email. Well, that video from the courthouse is everywhere." Jasmine turned from the window. "Video." Marcus nodded, pulling up a clip on his tablet. Someone in the gallery had recorded the entire confrontation on their phone. The footage, shaky but clear enough, showed the exact moment Judge Whitmore realized who she was. It had already accumulated 50,000 views on social media. At least they got my good side, Jasmine mused, watching herself present the badge. The gravity of the situation wasn't lost on her. This was exactly the kind of evidence her division had been trying to gather for months. Her private line rang again. This time, it was Judge Regina Carter, one of her mentors from Howard Law School. "Girl, you just shook the hornet's nest." The older woman's voice carried a mix of pride and concern. Word is Whitmore's been in closed-door meetings since he abandoned his docket. His clerk just resigned. His clerk resigned. Jasmine leaned forward. Apparently, she's been keeping her own records of his sentencing patterns. She's willing to testify. Judge Carter paused. "You know they're going to come at you hard for this, right? The old guard doesn't like being exposed." Before Jasmine could respond, Marcus appeared again. "The U.S. Attorney wants to see you." Now, the walk to the U.S. Attorney's office felt longer than usual. Staff members stopped their conversations as she passed, some nodding in approval, others quickly looking away. The morning's event had clearly divided the office. U.S. Attorney David Richardson was standing at his window when she entered, his hands clasped behind his back. At 68, he'd seen his share of legal battles, but this situation was unprecedented. "Sit down, Jasmine," he said without turning around. "I've got the Chief Judge of the State Court, the Judicial Qualifications Commission, and the Governor's office all calling about this morning's incident." He finally turned to face her. "Please tell me you actually have evidence to back up those accusations." Jasmine opened her laptop, pulling up a spreadsheet she'd been compiling for months. 6 months of data, sir. Every case in Whitmore's traffic court. Times, dates, defendants' races, charges, outcomes, and fine amounts. The pattern is undeniable. Richardson studied the screen, his expression darkening, and the audio recording. Perfectly legal. One-party consent. She handed him a flash drive. "I also have written statements from 3 public defenders who've witnessed similar behavior, but were afraid to come forward." The U.S. Attorney sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. "You know what you've started here. This isn't just about one judge anymore. If we pull this thread, the whole sweater might unravel." Jasmine finished. "Maybe it needs to." A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus again, looking apologetic. "Sorry to interrupt, but you both need to see this." He turned on the office television. Judge Whitmore was standing at a podium outside the courthouse, his face haggard. "This morning's events have been grossly mischaracterized," he was saying. "I have served this community with distinction for 20 years. Any suggestion of racial bias in my courtroom is not only false but defamatory. I intend to file a formal complaint against Assistant U.S. Attorney Washington for her unprofessional conduct and abuse of position." Richardson muted the TV, turning to Jasmine. "Still sure you want to do this?" Jasmine watched the muted screen where Judge Whitmore continued his tirade. She thought about every person who'd stood before him, powerless against his prejudices. Her hand unconsciously touched her badge through her jacket. "With all due respect, sir," she replied, her voice steady, "this isn't about what I want. This is about what's right." Richardson nodded slowly, a slight smile forming. "Then let's make it count." He reached for his phone. Time to show Judge Whitmore what real justice looks like. The game was officially on, and both sides knew. There would be no going back. The next week unfolded like a legal thriller. Lisa Chen, Judge Whitmore's former clerk, sat across from Jasmine in a downtown coffee shop, nervously turning a paper cup in her hands. Security cameras watched the entrance, a precaution insisted upon by the U.S. Attorney's Office. "I started keeping records after the Rodriguez case," Lisa explained, her voice barely above a whisper. A Hispanic grandmother driving her granddaughter to chemotherapy. Whitmore fined her $800 for going 5 miles over the limit. The same day, he dismissed an identical ticket for a white college student because, quote, Everyone makes mistakes. Jasmine's pen moved steadily across her notepad. How long have you been documenting these cases? 3 years. Lissa pulled out a thumb drive. Every case, every fine, every comment. I even noted his tone and body language. I kept telling myself I'd do something about it. But she trailed off, staring into her untouched coffee. But he was a judge, Jasmine finished softly. And you were just a clerk. The local news had already dubbed it Traffic Court Gate. By Wednesday, more witnesses emerged. Public defenders shared their data. Court reporters released transcripts. A pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. In her office, Jasmine spread the evidence across her conference table. Marcus pinned statistical analyses to the walls, graphs showing undeniable disparities in sentencing. Red lines for minorities, blue for white defendants, diverging like a roadmap of prejudice. The numbers are staggering, Marcus said, stepping back to survey their work. African Americans paid an average of 320% more in fines. Hispanics, 280% more, and the denial of procedural rights. He shook his head. It's systematic. Jasmine's phone buzzed. A text from Judge Carter. Turn on Channel 4. The television showed a crowd gathering outside the courthouse. Among them stood Mrs. Rodriguez, the grandmother from Lisa's story, holding a sign that read, "Justice shouldn't see color." Behind her, dozens more former defendants shared similar stories. The camera panned to show hundreds of people, their presence forcing the courthouse to close early. It's not just Whitmore anymore, Judge Carter said when Jasmine called her. People are coming forward about other judges, other courts. You've opened Pandora's box, child. The pressure mounted. Judge Whitmore's complaint against Jasmine backfired spectacularly when the media discovered his history of disparate treatment extended beyond traffic court. Property disputes, small claims, juvenile cases, the pattern held across the board. By Friday, the Georgia ACLU had filed a class action lawsuit. Civil rights organizations descended on Atlanta. The Department of Justice launched a formal investigation into systemic bias in the state's lower courts. Ms. Washington, reporters called out as Jasmine left the federal building that evening. Is it true Judge Whitmore has hired criminal defense counsel? Are there plans to examine other traffic courts? Is this part of a larger investigation? She kept walking, Marcus running interference, but paused at her car when she spotted a familiar face in the crowd, the elderly woman who had admired her purse in traffic court that fateful morning. "Thank you," the woman said simply, tears in her eyes. "My son lost his job last year because he couldn't pay Whitmore's fines, couldn't drive to work. Now maybe someone will finally listen." That night, alone in her office, Jasmine reviewed the surveillance footage from Whitmore's courtroom. Frame by frame, day after day, the evidence was damning. But it was the small moments that hit hardest, the subtle dismissals, the slight changes in tone, the 1,000 tiny ways justice had been denied based on nothing more than the color of someone's skin. Her phone lit up with a message from U.S. Attorney Richardson. Judicial Qualifications Commission meeting tomorrow. 9 a.m. Whitmore's requesting early retirement. Jasmine stared at the message, thinking about Lisa's quiet courage, Mrs. Rodriguez's sign, the elderly woman's tears. Early retirement wouldn't be enough. The system itself needed to change. She began typing her response, each word weighted with purpose. "Sir, I think it's time we looked at the bigger picture. This isn't about one judge anymore. It's about justice itself." The revolution that began in traffic court was about to go statewide. The Georgia Judicial Conference Center hadn't seen this much activity since its construction in 1985. At 9 a.m. sharp, Jasmine sat before the Judicial Qualifications Commission, her evidence organized in 4 thick binders. Judge Whitmore occupied a seat across the room, flanked by his attorneys from Adams and Porter, Atlanta's premier law firm for embattled public officials. "Let the record show," Commission Chair Justice Eleanor Matthews began, her voice carrying through the packed chamber, that this emergency session concerns allegations of systematic bias in the administration of justice in Fulton County Traffic Court, specifically regarding the conduct of Judge Richard Whitmore. The local news stations had set up camp outside, their satellite trucks creating a media city in the parking lot. Inside, the tension was palpable as Jasmine approached the podium. "Members of the commission," she began, her voice steady, "what you're about to see isn't just about numbers. It's about lives derailed by a system that was meant to protect them." She nodded to Marcus, who started the presentation. The first slide showed Maria Santos, a cleaning woman who lost her house trying to pay $2,300 in accumulated traffic fines. Next came James Turner, a college student forced to drop out when he couldn't drive to classes after a suspended license. Face after face, story after story, the human cost of judicial bias emerged in stark relief. In the past 5 years, Jasmine continued, Judge Whitmore has presided over approximately 15,000 traffic cases. Our analysis shows that defendants of color paid, on average, 312% more in fines than white defendants for identical violations. Whitmore's lead attorney stood up. Objection. These statistics are being presented without proper context. Factors such as prior violations, attitude in court. Are you suggesting, Jasmine interrupted, her eyebrow raised, that people of color inherently have worse attitudes in court? Because we have audio recordings that might suggest where the attitude problem truly lies. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Justice Matthews banged her gavel. Proceed, Ms. Washington. Lisa Chen was the next witness. Her hand shook as she took the oath, but her voice grew stronger as she described 3 years of witness discrimination. Judge Whitmore had a code, she explained. He'd tap his pen twice before handling cases involving minorities. It was his signal to the bailiff to watch them more closely, his signal to himself to, as he once said, make the punishment stick. During a brief recess, Jasmine found Judge Carter waiting in the hallway. They're streaming this online, the older judge said. It's trending nationwide. You're making history, child. When the session resumed, Judge Whitmore finally took the stand. Gone was the arrogant man from traffic court. In his place sat someone smaller, defensive, his carefully crafted world crumbling around him. I have served this community faithfully, he insisted, his voice cracking. Any disparities in sentencing were based purely on the circumstances of each case. Really? Jasmine approached with a transcript. Last month, you fined Sarah Miller, a white defendant, $120 for running a red light. She had 2 prior violations. The same day, you fined Robert Jackson, a black defendant, $750 for the same offense. No priors. Can you explain the difference? Whitmore shifted in his seat. I don't recall the specific cases. Fortunately, Jasmine pressed. We have the audio. She played the clips. In Miller's case, Whitmore was heard saying, "We all make mistakes." To Jackson, "People like you need to learn respect for the law." By day's end, the evidence was overwhelming. Justice Matthews called for a vote. The decision was unanimous. Immediate suspension, pending full investigation and probable removal from the bench. Outside, as the sun set over Atlanta, reporters surrounded Jasmine. What's next? They asked. Will there be criminal charges? She thought of Maria Santos, James Turner, and countless others whose lives had been affected. This isn't the end, she answered. It's a beginning. Today, we've shown that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. Back in her office, Jasmine found a note from Lisa Chen. Thank you for giving me the courage to speak up. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same. The next morning's headline read, Justice Served. Traffic court scandal sparks national debate on judicial reform. Judge Whitmore's kingdom had fallen, but the real work was just beginning. 3 months after the hearing, Judge Richard Whitmore sat alone in his home office, staring at an email that would change everything. The Georgia Judicial Reform Committee was offering him an unexpected chance at redemption, not as a judge, but as part of the solution. Dear Judge Whitmore, the email read, following our recent discussions regarding your experiences and your expressed desire to make amends, we invite you to join our newly formed Judicial Bias Training Initiative as a consultant. Your first-hand perspective on recognizing and overcoming systemic bias could prove invaluable. His cursor hovered over the delete button when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Jasmine Washington. I heard about the committee's offer. Her voice was professional, but carried a note of something else. Possibility. Before you decline, I'd like to meet. The next day, they sat across from each other at a quiet cafe in Midtown. Whitmore had aged years and months, his hair grayer, his shoulders hunched under the weight of public scrutiny and private reflection. Why did you request this meeting? He asked, unable to meet her eyes. Haven't you already won? Jasmine placed a thick folder on the table. This isn't about winning or losing, Judge Whitmore. It's about change. Real change. She opened the folder, revealing dozens of letters. These are from people you sentenced. They're not all angry. Many just want to understand why. She pushed one letter forward. This one's from Maria Santos, the cleaning woman who lost her house. She wrote, I don't want revenge. I want to make sure this never happens to another family. Whitmore's hands trembled as he read the letter. I never saw them as people, he admitted, his voice barely audible. They were just cases, numbers. I never thought about their lives, their families. That's exactly why we need you. Jasmine leaned forward. You've lived this transformation. You've seen both sides. Who better to help other judges recognize their own biases? The conversation lasted hours. Whitmore shared stories from his early days on the bench, how subtle prejudices had hardened into routine discrimination. Jasmine listened, occasionally taking notes, asking questions that forced him to dig deeper into his own psychology. I spent 40 years in the legal system, he finally said, believing I was colorblind, believing I was fair. It took losing everything to see how blind I truly was. 2 weeks later, Judge Whitmore stood before a room of judicial candidates at the State Bar headquarters. His hands were sweating, but his voice was clear. My name is Richard Whitmore, he began, and I'm here to tell you about the day I realized I was the very thing I claimed to be fighting against, an instrument of injustice. The training program, developed in collaboration with civil rights attorneys and psychological experts, became a model for judicial education nationwide. Whitmore's candid testimonials, combined with Jasmine's data and real-world cases, created a powerful tool for understanding and combating implicit bias. The hardest part, he told a reporter from the New York Times, is admitting that good intentions aren't enough. We have to actively examine our decisions, our assumptions, our very thought processes. 6 months into the program, Jasmine attended one of his sessions. She watched from the back as Whitmore played the audio from their confrontation in traffic court, using his own behavior to illustrate how bias manifests in subtle ways. Listen to my tone, he instructed the room. Notice how it changes based on the defendant's race. I never heard it before. I never wanted to hear it. After the session, he approached her. Thank you, he said simply. Not for exposing me, but for forcing me to expose myself to myself. Jasmine nodded. The system doesn't change until the people in it change. That evening, she added a new photo to her office wall. Herself and Whitmore standing with the first graduating class of the Judicial Bias Training Program. Below it, she placed Maria Santos' letter, its final words highlighted. Sometimes, the greatest justice comes not from punishment, but from transformation. The revolution that began in a traffic court had evolved into something more powerful than punishment. It had become a pathway to change. 1 year to the day after the traffic court confrontation, Jasmine Washington stood before the United States Supreme Court. The case, Washington v. Georgia Judicial System, a landmark challenge to discriminatory practices in lower courts nationwide. The marble columns of the highest court felt different from courtroom 4B, but Jasmine carried the same quiet confidence. In the gallery sat familiar faces: Lisa Chen, Maria Santos, Judge Carter, and even Richard Whitmore, now a leading advocate for judicial reform. "Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court," Jasmine began, her voice steady. "This case isn't just about traffic tickets. It's about the fundamental promise of equal justice under law, words carved into the very facade of this building." Justice Alina Martinez leaned forward. "Ms. Washington, your data from Georgia is compelling, but how do you respond to arguments that these are isolated incidents?" Jasmine gestured to the evidence binders. "Your Honor, since our initial case, 27 states have conducted similar analyses. The pattern is identical everywhere: minorities paying higher fines, receiving harsher sentences, and being denied procedural rights at dramatically higher rates than white defendants." "And your proposed solution?" Chief Justice Anderson inquired. "A three-pronged approach: mandatory bias training for all judicial officers, regular statistical review of sentencing patterns, and an independent oversight committee in each district." Jasmine paused. "We have already implemented this system in Georgia, with remarkable results." The numbers told the story. In the year since the reforms began, racial disparities in traffic court sentences had dropped by 67%. The program, now known as the Washington Protocol, was being studied by judicial systems worldwide. Later that evening, at a small gathering in her hotel room, Jasmine celebrated with her team. Marcus showed them the latest data on his tablet: courts across Georgia showing increasingly equal treatment regardless of race. "Remember when this all started?" Lisa Chen mused, sipping champagne. "One traffic ticket." Judge Carter raised her glass. One traffic ticket in the hands of someone who refused to be silent. A knock at the door revealed Richard Whitmore, holding a newspaper. The headline read, "Supreme Court appears poised to mandate judicial bias training nationwide." "I spoke to 3 other state Supreme Courts this week," he said, handing Jasmine the paper. "They're not waiting for the ruling. They're implementing the protocol voluntarily." Jasmine smiled, remembering that first confrontation. "How does it feel, being on the other side of history?" "Liberating," Whitmore replied. "Teaching others to recognize their biases. It's helped me recognize new ones in myself." "The work never really ends, does it?" "No," Jasmine agreed. "It doesn't." Her phone buzzed. A text from Maria Santos. The reforms had helped her recover her house, and she was now a community advocate for court reform. Attached was a photo of her granddaughter wearing a law school acceptance letter t-shirt. The next morning, Jasmine visited the Lincoln Memorial before heading home. Standing where Dr. King had dreamed of justice, she reflected on how change happens, not always in grand gestures, but in small moments of courage, in traffic courts and clerks' offices, in people willing to stand up and speak truth to power. Back in Atlanta, she returned to find her office transformed. Her team had created a wall of stories, photographs and letters from people whose lives had been touched by their work. At the center was a framed traffic ticket, now historic evidence of a revolution that began with a simple act of standing up. Marcus stuck his head in. "Ready for the next case? We've got reports of similar patterns in housing courts." Jasmine picked up her badge, the same one she'd shown in courtroom 4B a year ago. Its weight felt different now, not just a symbol of authority, but a reminder of responsibility. "Justice isn't a destination," she said, gathering her files. "It's a journey, and we've got a long way to go." As she headed to her next meeting, Jasmine passed the courthouse where it all began. The words "equal justice under law" had been newly carved above the entrance, a small change that symbolized a larger transformation. One traffic ticket had started a revolution, but it would take all of them to keep it going. The end.